So good morning, everybody, and thanks for coming back to week 2 of ESIP. And we have an exciting week planned for all of you, and there are a lot of great contributions to come. We were up to, I think, 432 members in the Kiko chat space. And I would invite you, if you haven't, to add a picture, because I do think that I will capture our final picture of everybody's faces stitched together like this at the end of the week. So one of the things that we have said is really important as we get into this virtual space and into the virtual conference is that we are really learning from this meeting, and we're learning from how we're doing things. And so we had our independent evaluator do an evaluation, a midpoint evaluation, just to see how things were going. And here are some of the things that people said were great and that they liked so far. So far, generally, the feedback was it was going better than people had expected. I think what was surprising to us was that people had made at least 1 to 2 new connections, and many had made more than that. So we were seeing upwards of 5 connections being made through this virtual meeting, which was a hope of mine, as you might remember from last week, that I didn't want you to just be sitting here passively absorbing information, but ESIP, what we know the value of ESIP is building these partnerships. And so it was exciting to see that that's happening. People liked the Zoom breakouts and the interactive facilitated parts of the session. And I think one of the other great things that we've seen, and it really goes to all of the work that our session conveners have done, is they liked the session content. Our average Schedule rating on the session content was around a 9.4. So people are giving a lot of smiley faces for those sessions, but also I think are really engaged. So I thought this generally was really positive for us, and we were happy to see these kind of results from the evaluation. But like I said, we're still learning. And so some of the things that people pointed out that were limiting and were tough were the Zoom limitations for some of our federal employees. We're getting around that with the YouTube live stream and the phone call in, but there's still some things like people can't annotate if they're just using the browser version. I'm going to cover a little bit of why we're using Kiko Chat and Sketch, but there was some confusion about why there were so many tools and what was the purpose of those tools. People are obviously bumping into people and are looking for more team building and social time. And so we are going to try to build in more of that this week, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. I think another thing that's really, it's posed as a negative, but it's actually really kind of a positive, is people are looking for more time for discussions. A lot of what we saw in the comments was when we put people into Zoom breakouts that they felt like they were being yanked back into the main room and they weren't done with their conversations. So I'll also talk about how we're providing some additional spaces for those conversations to happen. A lot of this obviously revolves around Zoom breakouts. And so another point that I think is really important to bring up is how to opt out of breakouts. If you don't want to go into a breakout or can't go into a breakout, I would invite you to rename yourself and just put a little X next to your name, and we won't put you into a breakout and we won't ask any questions. There are lots of reasons why you might not want to go into a breakout, but I, for one, know that sometimes when I'm being put into one of the Zoom breakouts, it feels a little bit nervous to me, and I just don't want to do it. And so just put an X next to your name. We won't put you in a breakout. And then finally, there was sort of 2 ends of the spectrum on communication. And so one end was there were too many emails, and I completely appreciate that. And so this week I'm going to take a lighter approach to the emails, and I would invite you, if you're feeling overwhelmed in the emails from Sketch, that you can opt out of those emails as well. So that should lighten the load of emails that you're getting from us, and we'll see how that works this week. I think there's probably some value in reminding people right before the session starts that the session is starting, but I appreciate that could be seen as really obnoxious too. So last week we opted for more emails, and this week we're going to opt for fewer emails. And just like I said at the bottom of this slide, we're still learning. And so all of this is an experiment, and we're really looking for your feedback. So a few more, one of the next things that we're doing this week, we'll have a few more kind of evaluation intensive options if you're interested in giving us feedback. And so we'll have 3 focus groups. One will be today, right after this plenary, and then there'll be 2 on Thursday. And if you're interested in being a focus group participant, it's a 20-minute conversation, and we will provide registration to the next meeting as a thank you for participating in that focus group. So I'm hoping that maybe Annie or Megan could put the doodle poll to this in the chat. And if you're interested, please join us and join us at 1 o'clock. So that's a little bit about the feedback that we've gotten so far. We will also we'll be having 3 focus groups this week. We have a series of interviews. So some of you have been picked at random to be interviewed by our evaluator, and we're really grateful for those people who are willing to have those one-on-one conversations. And then we'll have a follow-up post-meeting survey that'll come out on Thursday that will also be similar to what we ask midpoint, but we're really curious. Last week there was a steep learning curve in using the technology and figuring out where things were. And what I'm hoping is that maybe this week it's a little calmer and people are more comfortable with sort of where we're going and how this works. So that's just a bit about our mid-meeting feedback. I really appreciate everybody who took the survey, and I think generally, like I said, I think it was pretty positive, and that there are a lot of things that we are learning from. So to answer some of the questions about Schedge and KikoChat, so we used Schedge for pre-registered attendees to browse. This is how I think people decide if they want to come to our meeting or not. And then during the meeting, it acts as this personal calendar for you. So one of the things in reading the comments about not being sure about how to link between KikoChat and Schedge, I moved this direct link to KikoChat for the Zoom information to the top of all session description pages. So this week, it should be very easy for you to find that link to KikoChat. In addition, for people who are watching the stream is down at the bottom. We had found last week that when the stream was at the top and the KikoChat was small at the bottom, that people were just going to the YouTube stream and not interacting with us through the live session. So where we want you to be is on Zoom with us here. And if that's not possible, or you're looking for the recording of a session, you can find all of these live stream links are also the session recordings after the fact. And then I mentioned the evaluation. We're reading daily the feedback forms that we're getting on Schedge. So I would encourage you to give us feedback. It's easy to click the smiley face, and there's also a box for free text if you have more to say about a particular session. So that's a bit about Schedge. So Schedge is this way that we are browsing the meeting at a high level content and using these personal Schedges to remind us of where we're going. And then when we look at the Schedge page, we're clicking on this KikoChat link to go into the room. So this link takes you directly into the room. And so that leads us to KikoChat. And so unlike in a physical event where the hotel acts as the gate, KikoChat is our gate for the conference venue. So the reason that we're using KikoChat is because it does pull all of the meeting material together into a single place, but it acts as a structure or a framework for us so that registered attendees have a place that they can connect, and that the registered attendees are engaged in the interactive portions of the meeting, and non-registered attendees are not. And I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has any questions about this. The rooms change daily, just like a physical event. And the other thing that I want to call out is that in each of these rooms, the time in Eastern time is added at the top. So if you're not wanting to go back and forth between Schedge, you can see what's going to happen for the day in this plenary breakout page. So this is where we are now at the 11:30 plenary. And then there's always a link to the Schedge page from KikoChat. And I would also call your attention to the 3 takeaways. And if you were a session convener last week and haven't added your 3 takeaways, I would encourage you to update our takeaways doc so that we have that nice summary of the meeting content as well. So with that, I'd like for us to just take a quick minute, and in the chat, if you could just add an introduction of yourself with a one-liner. So this is one way that we're going to just do a little light networking as we get ready for our next speaker. So please, in the chat, just add your name, and then I would encourage you to just scroll that list. So I was reading an article last night about ways that we engage on the virtual conference space, and one of those ways is just by saying hi to somebody in the Zoom chat. So add your bio and a quick line, and while we're doing that, I would like to introduce Tim Newman, who is our first speaker this morning. And Tim is the project coordinator from USGS for the land imaging program. And he serves as this program coordinator for the $100 million per year USGS National Land Imaging Program, which develops and operates the Landsat satellites and provides the national portal to the largest civil archive of remotely sensed land data in the world. And I'm not going to go further with Tim's bio. I'm going to leave it here, and I'm going to let Tim take it away so that we give Tim the full amount of time. So I will stop sharing.
Very good.
And
I think
Matt is gonna, yep, Matt will take it away. And thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. So I'm coming to you live from my basement in Vienna, Virginia. This is all the stuff that I can't put anywhere else in the house, so it resides down here in the basement with me. All the Star Wars models, Packer memorabilia, and so forth. So, but it's a real privilege to be here. I look forward to having a discussion with you about our program, a little bit about USGS and what we do. So hopefully it'll be entertaining and informative for you. I think we'll just go ahead and get started on the next slide. I am the program coordinator within USGS. There are probably 25, 26 programs, and that's how USGS gets funded as a bureau within the Department of the Interior. So roughly $1 billion in the USGS budget. So our director is Jim Riley. He's actually an astronaut that flew on the space station. And he had an interesting vision for us for looking ahead over the next decade. He wants us to become better at pulling various observations together and then making predictions of the future state of the natural systems across the country and around the world. So within USGS, you have a large variety of scientific expertise that ranges from hydrologists, botanists, folks that develop energy across the world, geologists, hazard scientists. So we have quite a mix of disciplines that come together. And so the director's vision is to try to pull this together in a more coherent fashion, working with partners across the federal government, states, and academia to improve, develop our monitoring and forecasting capabilities. The forecasting is the key element of this vision. So not just monitoring the situation on the ground, but actually forecasting what might change in the coming decades. So that's an aspect that we've all taken to heart over the past couple of years, and we've started to build it into our programs, this projection or forecasting aspect. So these predictions can really help. I mean, if you think back to NOAA when they first started doing weather forecasting, it was certainly not an exact science. It's come a long way over the decades. If you're going to predict changes on the land surface, it's also something that's going to have a lot of error bars when you first get started. But I expect that over time it will get better. If you can go to the next slide, Matt. So that was our vision for science. These are the goals of the USGS. I think everybody understands the aspect of seismology that goes on within USGS, predicting or actually reporting on the earthquakes. And that's actually the biggest thing about USGS that people generally know is they report on earthquakes. But there are a lot of other disciplines across the Bureau. Energy and mineral resources is very important today, documenting the rare earth elements around the world. And there are many that wait for those reports every year that come out that describe where are these rare earth elements. We do a lot of also science to inform species management and land management. We are the science arm of the Department of the Interior. So Interior manages over 500 million acres within the United States, and then much of the continental shelf. So they need a science agency to help them make decisions on how to manage that land, and that's what USGS does. I'll point to the mapping and land imaging. That's actually where my program comes into play, is delivering imagery from space to help manage the land surface. And then we also have an organizational and infrastructure piece that, just like a lot of agencies, the infrastructure is crumbling. So there's a lot of effort to refurbish those facilities. Next slide, Matt. So EarthMap is also something that came from our director. As he started to see all these various activities across USGS kind of disconnected and working in separate activities, he thought that what we really want to do is bring all these experts together, and so have them work and try to solve problems together in an integrated fashion. And so that's what EarthMap is all about: Earth system monitoring, assessments, and projections. And it speaks again to that predictions or forecasting element that is new. That's something we haven't done much of within USGS, and I think it's something it's really exciting as we look to the future. How we're going to do this, boy, it's not going to be easy. There are a lot of data sets that reside in all of these different disciplines. How do you pull those kind of data sets together in a coherent fashion so that you can compare different data sets and use them interchangeably? That's a huge challenge, and that's a key part of what EarthMap will become. EarthMap isn't intended to be just a USGS activity. It's meant to bring in many other agencies into that vision so that we can have more interoperable data sets across the different agencies, and in addition to academia and the commercial sector. So it's a challenging vision, and it's one that we've been trying to start to execute over the past couple of years. Next slide. So this is the USGS, the different mission areas. There are actually 7 at this time. Energy and mineral resources has been merging with environmental health, and we're also going to be merging land resources with core science systems. But it's a big bureau. We've got 8,500 employees, field science centers all across the country, and field offices, thousands of stream gauges and seismic monitoring stations that have to be managed on an operational basis, and that get replenished and serviced annually. We have a very large archive out at EROS, the Earth Resources Observation and Science Center in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So it's a huge archive with a lot of data, not just Landsat data, but many other data sets as well. And of course, we own 2 satellites that are flying in space today. So that's something most people don't know about when it comes to USGS. Next slide. So my program, the National Land Imaging Program, has a number of roles and responsibilities. We actually have a public law that was written back in the 90s that governs our activities. And so we refer to that often. It's our job to operate and maintain an archive of basic data. And we do that at EROS in Sioux Falls. That data needs to be available for anyone who needs to use it. So there are no issues with folks from across the US, around the world, taking that data and using it for their purposes. We operate and maintain the satellite systems, as I mentioned earlier. That's just the 2 satellites in orbit, and then the ground systems that operate that satellite. We are also responsible for requirements. So our job is to gather the user needs or requirements across the civil agencies to determine what types of needs do they have that could be met potentially by satellite data and other data sets. We collect, archive, process, and distribute the Landsat data. So it's not just about flying the satellite, obviously. It's about pulling down the data, processing it, and turning it into products that users can access and make use of. We also have an aspect that we want to try to preclude duplication of acquisition. So there's a lot of commercial data sets that are purchased across the civil federal agencies. Not a lot of sharing sometimes with those purchases. So that's an aspect of our program that we do. And then finally, developing civil applications and information tools, again, to make this imagery more useful to the public. The public bought these systems. These are $1 billion assets in space. So it's our job to try to turn as much of that into valuable information and products for them as we can. So the next slide speaks to our program components. Most of our dollars are procured on the satellite operations side. So our job is to, as I said before, collect, archive, process, and disseminate Landsat data. We also collect Sentinel-2 data. That's a system that's like Landsat that's produced in Europe. It doesn't have exactly the same bands, but it also collects moderate resolution data, 30-meter, 10-meter data that can be used by scientists. We operate the 2 satellites. There's a lot of cal-val activities to make sure the data is accurate. We're also developing the ground system for Landsat 9. That's the next mission. And so we've been working with NASA for launch for next year. We have probably a summertime 2021 launch next year. So we're getting close to about a year out from that. And then I mentioned the requirements earlier. Those requirements help inform what's really exciting is the mission after Landsat 9. And so we called it, curiously, Landsat Next. So rather than saying Landsat 10, the thought was this could be a different approach for Landsat. We might be looking at an architecture of capabilities rather than a single mission. And so Landsat Next, I'll be talking about that a little bit later. We also invest in a lot of science, research and investigations. So mainly looking at new applications, new products and services. How can we, again, provide a better value to the taxpayer? We do work with unmanned aircraft systems, UAS. There are a lot of operational products that we put out. Our UAS activities went to Kilauea last year when the earthquake or when the volcano was erupting. And we got a lot of really cool imagery and data from those UAS. And then we also have a classified activity, the National Civil Applications Center, which is able to take National Security Space System data, all the cool classified stuff, and we're able to use that for certain USGS applications. And so we have a committee called the CAC, the Civil Applications Committee, which oversees the proper use of that data for the federal civil agencies. But in the end, our goal is to provide this data record for the public, both its historical condition, current state, and to predict the future of the land area. So what is Landsat? I think most of you probably know what Landsat is. This is like the one slide version of it. It is almost 50 years now we've been collecting Landsat imagery of the Earth's surface. It is the longest, most widely used land imaging data set in the world. It's used to help understand change that happens on the land surface. Land use, land cover change is the biggest single use. Of course, that covers a broad spectrum of applications. Agriculture, forestry, ecosystems are all big users of the data. This is not a system you can see your house with. This is a 15-meter at the best. 30-meter is the normal scale for a lot of the spectral bands. But with 30 meters, you can resolve what's happening on the land surface. So changes that have been caused either by humans or by natural conditions. So you can see all that with Landsat imagery. And I think the interesting part about this also is the immense amount of material of imagery we collect every day. It's about 15 million square miles per day, which is equivalent to North America and Europe every day being collected and stored in the archive at AROS and made available for folks to come and look at. It also is highly calibrated data. So this isn't just pictures from space. This is scientific data. And that data can be used to tease out some of the more subtle trends that happen on the land surface as things change. You might see a change and think, is that a real change on the ground, or was that an issue with the satellite in space? Maybe changes on the instrument and so forth. Well, we take pains with the system to make sure that that's not a system issue. That's actually a real change that's happening on the Earth's surface. And we had 30 million products distributed by USGS last year. So we continue since the free and open data policy to experience huge usage across both within the US and around the world. Many different applications, and I'll leave that for you to look at, but kind of the Swiss Army knife in space. Many different uses for the system. So where are we with the missions? I mentioned earlier that we have 2 satellites in space, Landsat 7 and Landsat 8. They collect 1,100, 1,200 new images every day. Landsat 9, we're preparing again for launch next year with NASA, with our NASA partner. It's slightly improved from Landsat 8. It's not identical. There's a little bit more data there, and it's upgraded as far as its support systems. Landsat Next is aiming for late 2020s launch. We've done a lot of work with NASA over the past 2 years to understand what the technology looks like out there today. Of course, there's been a lot of change in the Earth observation marketplace, and there are many systems out there today that weren't there 10 years ago. So we had an architecture study team look very carefully at the trends in technology, also looking at the user needs we collected. Users want more data. They don't want less. They want more data. They want more spectral coverage. They want better repeat over the surface that they're interested in. And they want better spatial resolution so they can see down to 10 meters instead of 15. So a lot of those changes are going to be implemented in the new system. We can't talk about it yet. It will be publicly released most likely when the FY22 president's budget goes to the Hill, which would be February of next year. But it's exciting, it's fun, I think the users are going to be really happy with what NASA and DOI are working on. And then, of course, at the bottom, I mentioned the archive. Millions of scenes are available, a lot of downloads since we went to the free and open data policy. So Landsat past and present, I mentioned the partnership between NASA and USGS. It's called Sustainable Land Imaging, kind of an awkward name, but that was the name we took back in 2016 to describe the partnership between the agencies. So the administration back then, even before then, realized that there are a lot of folks that depend on Landsat. They didn't want it to be left to the whim of a single agency. They wanted a structured approach to ensure 2 decades or more of continuous Landsat into the future. So hence the agreement was struck between DOI, USGS, and NASA. So we have various roles and responsibilities within that agreement. We've conducted this architecture study that I discussed earlier, and we'll be getting the information out on that soon, sometime over the next 5-6 months. We do see again that that's going to be an exciting development, but this kind of points to the history of the program going all the way back to 1972. You can see when the first Landsat was launched, and we're quite proud of the long tradition of this program. So P3's land imaging and future considerations, we expect, as we did the architecture study, that there are more players today than there were 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so we're really looking to partner with those players in different and new and innovative ways. So full, free, and open Landsat imagery is a tenet of the program. We also want to generate new and improved data products. So we do feel like there could be some really cool ways to do public-private partnerships as we move out into this future of Landsat. There has been some of that historically with value-added contributors for Landsat, but I think we all know we can do a little better in that arena. So we've been taking some planning efforts with NASA to see how could we partner more on these different aspects of the mission that you see below. So this is just an interesting network analysis that we've done with data that came from the Earth Observation Assessment from 2016. So it's pretty messy. It's quite a spaghetti of information here. But if you look on the left of the diagram, you can see the Landsat data coming from the sensors. So you see visible shortwave infrared, you see thermal infrared, you see the archive. Users specified how did they get their data? What did they rely on? And then on the far right, you see the different bureaus within the Department of the Interior. So national parks, fish and wildlife, and so forth. What they really know, and it's interesting, some users don't even know that the information that they're making use of came from Landsat. They just know that they like a certain forest restoration research project, something called Landfire, perhaps other interim products that are created initially from Landsat data being coupled with other types of information. And so you see this weird kind of mix, this analysis, this tracing that can be done to convince somebody from BLM, for example, that they are using thermal infrared data from Landsat. They may know it, but they also may not know it because they're used to getting a certain product. So we have network diagrams like this that are helping. It kind of leads to USGEO a little bit, where it leads to an understanding across the U.S. Group on Earth Observation agencies that there are a lot of interim products in here that are just as important as the initial data that comes from the satellites on the far left. And so in some sense, we forget that, and we focus a lot on the sensors themselves and less on the actual information products that are generated as they go to the user. So we had recently commissioned an economic evaluation of Landsat. It happened, there was one actually back in the 2012 timeframe. And so this was updated, and the latest estimates are shown to be about $3.5 billion in annual benefits from Landsat across the world. So $3.5 billion, about 2.2 billion of that came from US users. So 2.1 billion. So you see a tremendous return on the investment that the US has made in these systems. I told you they're about $1 billion systems individually. But that $1 billion can be spent over a decade in development and operations. What you're seeing here is a multi-billion return every year from these Landsat satellites. And so there's a lot of folks that rely on this across agribusiness and science and a lot of other aspects. And so this was just an interesting study that came back with a number. These are just more users, operational programs, and applications for Landsat. What we've found from the private sector, and we have a lot of discussions with them, is that they rely on systems like Landsat to help them calibrate their data. So their data systems are very rudimentary. The smaller satellites that are up there, they tend to degrade in space. But if you have an absolute reference like Landsat data that doesn't degrade, then you can actually improve the products that come from Planet and from other systems that are up there. So they made that very clear to us when we talked to them. Don't stop doing these very accurate systems, because there are a lot of folks that rely on those, on the data that comes from those. So I mentioned earlier that we do a lot of product generation and processing. So the level one is really kind of the data that comes down from the satellite with very minimal processing. So that's we do train, correct it, orthorectify it. Traditionally, that was the level one scene or product or image that people have been using for decades on Landsat. But what we found over the last several years is that people want more than that. If you're a remote sensing scientist, you can manipulate the data and get what you want out of it. But for most of us who are not the remote sensing scientists, we like products for the atmosphere and create products that are really surface products. So surface indices, dynamic surface water extent is like, what's the extent of surface water in the United States at any given time, and which is a very powerful set of information mapping that you can do with Landsat down to 30-meter resolution. There are a number of other products related to snow-covered area, burned area, and a new one with the evapotranspiration that just came out in the past week. So we're striving always to try to improve the products that we deliver. And then I think what we're going to show with these are some of the products we've been working on. LC-MAP, you may see the acronym as being similar to EarthMap. That's no coincidence. So LC-MAP, we started a few years ago to really forecast land change on the Earth's surface. So the monitoring piece is something we've been doing for a while, but we came up with some new algorithms working with Boston University that allowed us to really go back and leverage the data from the historic Landsat archive and look at a certain area. So in this case, you're looking at Richland, Washington, and you can see the changes that happen over decades in that area. So the color codes can see orange is agriculture. You can see the growth of cities. You can track the water as lakes come and go, as rivers expand. You can see where the developed areas are, which is where the red area is. And so what we've created with LC-MAP is a way to do this anywhere in the country. You could do this today. You can get on Earth Explorer, the website called Earth Explorer, and find LC-MAP and circle any area that you want in the country, and you can automatically generate these land cover classifications for any time period that you're looking at. So for example, if you want to look at the effects of a policy, a new policy that had just been enacted maybe by a local government, you could go back and you can see changes that happen on the land surface based on the policy being enacted. We think it's a really powerful tool. We're going to eventually build in a forecast aspect as well. So you can not only stop with the most recent imagery that's been collected, but you can go forward into time and see what would the projection look like based on the data that's been collected. And so it's very powerful. It's a fun new capability that I would recommend that you go take a look at if you have a chance.
This is just the 5-minute warning.
Okay. So what you'll see in the rest of the slides here, and we can stop when the time comes, but there are a lot of different applications. So these are the fire applications that Landsat's most known for. MTBS, Bear, and Landfire. A lot of these are done with other agencies, and so we provide the data. There is a science component to it, but fire science for USGS is really about preparing for the fire season, and then after fires have gone through, how do we do remediation in those areas? So it's less about active firefighting as it's going on, and it's more about preparing for fire season with information that the people on the ground need. Global crop monitoring has been an application of Landsat for many decades. It kind of actually got the program started way back when. It allows you to track agriculture across the world. So this isn't just in the US, this is everywhere, and allows you to see how are the wheat crops doing anywhere in the world. And so Foreign Ag Service does a lot of work with Landsat data in that regard. Invasive species mapping has been pretty big. Cheatgrass, especially tracking cheatgrass. There was an application I just saw yesterday that came out that was Western Governors Association has been working to track cheatgrass in the Western United States, and Landsat's been used for that purpose as well. I'll mention Sentinel-2 data. With Sentinel-2 being in a slightly different orbit than Landsat, the revisit between the two Sentinel-2s and the two Landsats can be down to less than 3 days anywhere in the world. So in every 3 days at least, you'll get either a Landsat or a Sentinel image. And what we've been doing is working with the Europeans to develop a harmonized data set between those two systems so that a user doesn't necessarily have to worry about just waiting for the next Landsat scene. He can look and see what kind of changes happen on a 2 to 3 day basis across some area of interest. And so we've spent a lot of time working with NASA and Europe on that one. This is actually an example of that partnership. You can see a port in Europe, and you can see how the changes occur through the course of a year. And the changes sometimes are just every couple of days, depending on how often the imagery goes over. And so you can see changes that are happening maybe based on flooding that's occurring or other natural or human changes that are happening on the surface. So our program, SLI I spoke of as being between NASA and USGS, so that's kind of the middle circle or object here. But NLI, National Land Imaging, is our program that actually does more than that. So we have the airborne, we have other spaceborne systems. And so in essence, again, our primary mission is that global survey, but we do a lot of other related activities as well. So I promised that I would show you all the other data sets that are at the Aero Center, Earth Resources Observation and Science Center. So it's not, again, just satellite imagery, and it's not just Landsat. There's a lot of other data sets. And if you just look for Earth Explorer, the website, it's one word, Earth Explorer, you can get any of these data sets across some are global data sets, some are just US, but very interesting source of a lot of information for whatever you might need it for. And then this is our last slide. It kind of speaks to our program, the different elements of our program, which include improving our operational capabilities, doing more research, development, and innovation. Those are in the blue, expanding our products and services, which is in the yellow, and then community engagement in the orange. So all of these, starting at the bottom with Landsat 8 and working your way up through to Landsat Next, the point of all of this is to do a better job of satisfying the user's needs. So understanding the user needs comes first. And then now that you understand them, how can we meet them? How can we serve them? And it isn't just with Landsat, it's with a lot of other systems and services as well. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. I haven't been monitoring the chat, Tim, so maybe you could take a look and see, was there anything that came out of there that we should address?
Yeah, so thanks so much, Tim. I think Tim Stryker is going to turn on his camera now too. And we've been catching the questions pretty well in Slido. And there are, I think, a couple of good ones to start. So Tim Stryker, you might still be muted. And I'm putting, oops.
Muted now. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, great.
And I'm going to put the Slido link again in the chat. And everybody, you can upvote these questions if there are things that look interesting to you. So guys, we have about 5 minutes for questions.
Okay, very good. So yes, you get 2 Tims for the price of 1 with USGS. Just going through the Slido questions here and looking at those that got the most votes to start with. Tim, how does USGS interact and collaborate with equivalent organizations outside of the US, especially given the global nature of the many data sets?
Good question. We have quite a few mechanisms, actually. We have bilateral relationships with a number of countries. And actually, this is actually Tim's area of expertise, so I'm answering for him in some sense. But we have a lot of bilateral relationships. We also belong to Committee on Earth Observation Satellites, CEOS, a lot of international groups, like the International Charter, GEO, the Group on Earth Observations. So there's quite a bit of extensive interaction with the international folks. We have ground stations around the world and we have agreements with them. Those are our international cooperators that receive Landsat data directly into their countries as the satellites come overhead. And so we have a long history of working with those folks. So Tim, I'll leave it to you maybe if you want to add anything.
No, I think that's a good summary. We certainly have global interests and we leverage a lot of foreign partners' capabilities to better serve our users. So I'm happy to share more information with others who are interested. Going on the vote total here, we've heard of rumors about efforts to implement cost recovery for Landsat. Is that something we need to be worried about?
Yeah, I don't think I would worry about it. I think there was a study done by our Landsat Advisory Group last year at the request of the Department of the Interior. I would say that every administration that comes in, one of the first things they ask is, gosh, you're giving away 30 million of these a year. What if we just sold them for 10 cents a piece? Think how much we could generate. And I think it's a fair question. And so we had a Landsat Advisory Group, which is our non-feds, come together and provide a paper to do some research on that. And they recommended very strongly not to change that policy with the current missions or with Landsat 9. Now, if we go forward into Landsat Next, it's possible that we could strike a public-private partnership where portions of the data would be free and then other products potentially could be paid for. So, but all that's open for the future as we decide what Landsat Next is going to look like and what's in the best interests of the users. So, good question.
Okay, another question. Users would love to see how we can access Landsat imagery as quickly as possible as web services, so we can overlay pictures from the field, model output, and critical infrastructure to help the movement of utility vehicles across the nation. And other applications as well. Also interest in rapid access to higher level Sentinel-2 products.
So when it comes to Landsat, we have heard the need from a lot of the users that they would like to see more near real time imagery that comes back from the satellite. Normally, almost everything is processed within, say, 12 hours of collection. So when the satellite picks up the imagery, it comes back over a ground station at some point and beams the data back down. And then we take that to Eros, we process it there, and then post the processed image, usually within 12 hours of collect, sometimes later than that. So we have stride. We have started to study how could we do that faster. And in some cases, if we have a lot more humans involved in the loop, you can do it faster if it's in response to an emergency or so forth. So we hear that, and we will be looking at that requirement as we go forward on future systems.
Okay.
So Tim, let's go maybe one more question. There was a question about early career.
Yep.
Lost it. Let's end with that one.
Tim, if you could give advice to early career scientists on the skills needed to best utilize the Landsat archive, what would it be?
So I think if you look at AmericaView, I don't know if you're familiar with AmericaView, and it's a consortium of 30 states around the country that have educational programs in remote sensing, and they feature Landsat imagery, but they also look at a lot of other imagery sets. But they've been providing the STEM type training for folks how to make more use of remote sensing. So I think there still are remote sensing degrees out there that you can get. I think any GIS user is probably going to be trained sufficiently to make use of the Landsat archive, but I would highlight those skill sets.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks, Tim, for helping to moderate these questions. Tim Newman, there are a lot of other questions coming in through Slido. Some really, I think, interesting questions. So if we have time at the end, we can come back to some more questions, or you can figure out how to answer those offline for attendees. But one, thanks to the audience, and two, thanks to you for giving us this really, I think, interesting presentation that was perfect for our theme. So I see Lawrence Friedel. Martine, if you are able to turn your camera on too, I think then Tim Newman, I'll turn it back over to you to introduce USGEO.
Very good. I think Matt has a few slides that he's going to bring up for those, but as the program coordinator for National Light Imaging, I also happen to be a co-chair on a group called the US Group on Earth Observations, or USGEO. And so Lawrence Friedel is my fellow co-chair from NASA, and then Martine Yapur is from NOAA. He's serving in that capacity. So I think at this point, I think I'll ask Lawrence, would you like to walk through these slides, Lawrence, or do you prefer I do that, or what do you prefer?
If you'd like to, Tim, that's fine with me. Or we can come back and forth. So,
okay. So Eric Noble is actually the co-chair from OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and he sends his apologies. He was not able to make it today. But I think between Lawrence and Martine and myself, and maybe some assistance from Tim, I think we can probably get a good message across on what USGEO is. And then we're going to feature the 2019 National Plan for Civil Earth Observations, which was released back in December of the past year. So let's just move on to the next slide. So I'll just ask Lawrence and Martine to feel free to jump in to elaborate on anything I say here. So USGEO is really the means by which the executive branch coordinates science and technology policy. So you have OSTP at the highest level serving the president with this National Science Advisor. You have the National Science and Technology Council, and then that's work is broken down into committees. So you have the Committee on Environment. The Committee on Environment coordinates work related to polar research, ocean sciences, and we highlighted Earth observation because that's what USGEO is focused on. So US Group on Earth Observations represents 15 departments, agencies, and the White House. It's a great example of how we can pull different agencies together to work together to get some good things done for the country. So these are the USGEO members. The co-chairs, as I spoke to earlier, are the Office of Science and Technology Policy, Eric Noble, NOAA with Martine, NASA with Lawrence, and myself with USGS. And so these are the agencies that participate. We have monthly meetings where we come together with agendas to in many senses, share our lessons learned across Earth observations and what we do in those different arenas. Also, I'll point out that OMB is a part of those discussions. So it isn't just the Office of Science and Technology Policy, it's also the Office of Management and Budget. And so when you're talking in Washington, OMB is a very powerful entity, and it's really wonderful that we have OMB participation in all of our meetings. So the USGEO Subcommittee has many different functions that we provide. Facilitating that cooperation and collaboration between the feds and the non-feds is one of those. So we look for opportunities to engage outside the federal community and because we realize that there are many different observing systems and networks. Some are owned by the government, of course, and by our agencies, but many are not. Many are out there either in academia or in the private sector, international arenas. And so there are also data management activities out there. So our point is we want to facilitate collaboration across those federal and non-feds communities. We also look for mechanisms for advice, to provide advice to us from outside the federal government. So there is input for both national and international Earth observations and data management activities. And then we make and set policy for federal Earth observations and systems. So the policy is an important aspect, and I think when you get to the national plan, you'll see some elements of policy that have been laid out in that plan. But we do considerably review the data that's needed and recommendations for future observations planning. These are some objectives of the USGEO Subcommittee as expressed in the national plan. I mentioned that was released back in December. It's out there and available. If you go to the OSTP website, you can get a copy of it. I think it may even be accessible via the White House site, but that's out there. The purpose of that plan was really to help us achieve the following policy objectives. And one was to do planning and coordinating our different observational activities. So within the federal government, you have NASA, USGS, and NOAA that provide a lot of these Earth observation systems, particularly from space. The national plan actually covers more than just space. So we're talking about airborne in situ data as well. It's not just a space document. But we all, a lot of the agencies are users of Earth observation data, and then there are many that are providers. And so the point is, let's get those agencies together on a regular basis to help plan and coordinate all these different systems and activities. We also look for ways to improve the data management. I spoke to EarthMap on the previous presentation, but how do we have all these disparate data sets? How can we pull them together and manage them in a more coherent fashion? So maybe it involves standards for the data. How do we improve that interoperability? It might be with calibration validation activities. That's a really important aspect of USGEO. We have done in the past a lot of work on the user needs for Earth observation. So across all these agencies, everybody has an understanding of how they use Earth observation data. So I mentioned the Earth observation assessment that was done back in 2016, which was basically looking at all experts from across all these agencies to understand better which of these systems do they rely on the most, how do they use Earth observation data, what types of needs do they have. So that's an important aspect. And then finally, USGEO is of course the a US activity, but we participate in something called GEO, which is the Intergovernmental Group on Earth Observations, which is a international selection of countries that get together and share the same types of insights that we do between the agencies with USGEO, but they do it globally. So you can imagine all of the Earth observation systems that are out there, spaceborne, airborne, in situ, that all of the countries use and provide, and that this is a forum for all those folks to get together. So quite a massive effort. But our job within USGEO is to formulate how should we work with them? What types of policies do we want to push? What would we like to see from the international GEO? That's another aspect of USGEO. So the next several slides are going to get into the national plan with a little more specificity. There really were three overarching goals that were put forth with this national plan. And then there are a series of objectives and actions for each of these. So this kind of captures at a high level what those three major goals were. One was to make sure that we have a balanced Earth observation portfolio across the public, academic, and private sectors. So what we want to do is make sure we understand how folks are using our Earth observation portfolio today. We want to make sure that systems that they depend on will continue to be there in the future so that there won't be breaks in those systems. We want to make sure that we understand the private sector contribution to that portfolio. There are many private sector systems that are used by the agencies today, across all those agencies. We want to make sure that that is there as well. And then, of course, the academic aspect. The EO enterprise, I'll talk a little bit about the Earth Observations Enterprise, kind of a phrase that we coined for this plan to describe that this isn't just about the federal government agencies and their uses of observations. This is meant to lay out a definition for what we call this enterprise, which is the federal government, it's academia, it's international, it's private sector, NGOs. They're all involved in this as a common enterprise. They're all using Earth observation data sets from each other. They're making contributions in Earth science from all these different observations. And so we wanted to write a plan that wasn't just for the federal agencies, it was for this entire enterprise, for this group of folks that are inside and outside of government, and let them know that they rely on outside the federal government, they rely on federal government systems. We within the federal government rely on outside systems. So really we should be trying to work together as well as we can, as closely as we can, to make sure that we understand each other and can continue to provide the data that we need. And so that phrase is used throughout the document. And then finally, the last item here is assessing and improving the impact of Earth observations. We spend a lot of money on those systems. How do we get the best bang for the buck from all these different systems? Some of it gets to the product generation that I spoke to in the last presentation. But how do we increase the impact? And it may be through better understanding how others use these systems. They may be using systems in a way we're not familiar with. Maybe there's international collaboration that can be done. I spoke to the Sentinel-2 Landsat harmonization. That's an example of how you can increase the impact of a system by harmonizing it with another data set from another country. And then the workforce development. This gets to the last question we had in the previous presentation, but what do we need from people coming out of universities today? What does that future workforce look like? And so we gave some thought to that as well in this plan. So this is the first goal. So for each of the goals I mentioned, we'll have a few slides that dig a little deeper into it. So supporting and balancing the portfolio of Earth observations. We want to make sure to prioritize the availability and continuity of Earth observations. We want to implement innovative procurement strategies. What I found, particularly within the agencies, is we're all part of the federal government, but it turns out we all buy things a little bit differently. So NASA does things differently than NOAA, who does things differently than USGS. So what we wanted to try to do is, are there ways to really find the real innovative approaches and then start to share those across the agencies? That was an important aspect of the plan. We also want to strengthen the research that leads to more usability of these systems. How do we make them more friendly to the end user? How can we provide something that's going to actually help them solve their application that actually is easy to use? And so that's something that is a theme of the plan. And then the long-term stewardship. Many of the agencies hold on to data sets and manage data sets for decades. USGS, for example, has the Landsat archive. So what does that mean in the future? Like, we've been keeping a database and archive for decades. How do we do that into the future? What types of technologies are out there and available to us? How would, say, the commercial cloud come into play for that? How do we provide this data set for over decades into the future? So that's another aspect of this goal. So for each of the goals that I mentioned, there are actually actions or tasks that have been defined. And so you'll see 30 plus actions in the national plan. And so those actions are led by different agencies within USGEO, but generally you get participation from almost all of them as we move forward and try to actually execute these actions. Some of them have already begun and we're well underway, and others are just getting started. So the first one at the top is working across the enterprise to do better in seasonal and subseasonal forecasting. That was a highlight of OSTP. They thought we need to be doing a better job when it comes to that. So that's built into as an action. A lot of agencies are using commercial data today. I mentioned that in the last presentation as well. What would be the best practices for doing commercial data buys across the agencies, and working with the commercial providers to come at what would be what are some of the hurdles that the commercial companies have in delivering their data to us? Would there be ways to make the data more discoverable and usable? The market-driven clearinghouse gets to also, once one agency buys some data, would there be a way to make that data accessible to other agencies, perhaps to use without any additional cost? Are there ways that we could create a clearinghouse where if one agency bought something, then everyone might be able to get access to it? Calibration is really critical. I spoke to that a little bit in the last presentation as well. To really understand data from a sensor, you need to have it calibrated. You need to calibrate it against something, hopefully an absolute reference. So what are the procedures for calibrating these sensors into the future? There are more and more sensors available out there. We have mechanisms like the JC, the Joint Agency Commercial Imagery Evaluation Activity, that does some of that cross-calibration. But we understand that that's an important aspect of this. And then finally, I mentioned commercial cloud and high performance computing have become more and more prevalent. How do we integrate that into our agencies, maybe in a more common way? Are there ways that we can take advantage of those technologies and others to continue to serve the public that uses our data sets? So that brings us to goal 2. Remember, there were 3 goals. So this is the second goal, engaging that enterprise. And so there were 3 components of that: strengthening coordination. Some of that comes from just increasing the recognition that you are part of the enterprise. You may not even realize you are part of something called an enterprise for Earth observations, but part of what we want to do is reach out to many different groups to let them know that we rely on them and we know they're using our systems, and create the concept, the identity of an Earth observations enterprise. Recognizing and analyzing program models for leveraging data as a strategic asset. We thought that was another interesting addition to goal 2. And then coordinating R&D in experimental technologies and techniques, because I think we can all learn to share. We can always do a little bit better than we are with some of the product generation techniques that we have today. So these are the actions for goal 2 that involve engaging the enterprise. We want, and basically, you know, as we develop this plan, a lot of the co-chairs and others sat down for many days and tried to think, well, how could we advance this? What kinds of things can we do to improve the concept of an Earth observation enterprise, to get folks out there to think as part of this team? And so we know that we need to work with those providers to understand what are the issues that they see. What issues do they see as they're trying to perhaps sell their data to the federal government? And these may not even be data providers, they may be services providers. What types of hurdles do they have, maybe with the acquisition process or with anything in dealing with the federal government? Maybe there are things that we can do to help them and make it easier for them to get their data to us. So we wanted to also create opportunities for the entire enterprise to comment or provide feedback on new systems that are coming down the pike. So I mentioned to you that USGS is looking at with NASA a new Landsat approach, Landsat Next. How do we get feedback from the enterprise that are users of these systems so that they can actually give us some insight that we can then put into these new systems? So we thought that was important. A feasibility study to advance the enterprise and scope an open competition program. How can we maybe look at some of these challenge grants and other opportunities that we could then advance our enterprise for different technologies that are out there to do a little better job there? How do we know we're successful perhaps with the systems that we put out there? How do we know that Landsat data is serving a need out there outside of the federal government? So that kind of gets to this one. And then engaging the enterprise to identify where are some high priority research areas. Are there ways to coordinate our investments across some of these technologies like cloud and other places in order to serve the community a little bit better? And then finally, I think we highlighted this one in red because we thought it was maybe especially interesting to this group. Take part in a focused initiative to look for new Earth observations that maybe are out there that were not collected by federal agencies, and then look for ways that we might be able to bring those data sets into federal archives and make them more accessible and discoverable. And this is the last goal, goal 3, improving the impact. That comes, there are 4 general areas here. How do we articulate the value of Earth observations? You can imagine if someone says, well, why should we invest in another Landsat satellite? So how much money is it really saving? So, well, actually a study was done, as I referred to it on the last presentation. But studies like that are imperfect. And so we're always striving to tell that story better. How do these systems really provide value to our society? And so we're looking for ways to share that across the agencies. Improving our portfolio through the introduction of new technologies. There are always new phenomenologies out there that we don't take full advantage of. How do we bring those in? How do we leverage collaborations to get what we need internationally and share lessons that they may have learned? And then finally, the skilled and capable workforce that we need. How do we develop that and make sure it's there? And then these are the individual actions within the theme that I just laid out for goal 3. So I'll just maybe leave these for you. Develop a catalog of ways to quantify the economic value. We have done some work on this already, bringing different folks together from different agencies that have done these types of studies so that we can get a catalog of how are the different ways you can determine economic value of these systems. We also want to provide a database that has these narratives all in one place so that we can collect these stories and narratives that are out there on the benefits of Earth observations so that we can all tap into them. Looking at tools and capabilities this goes back actually to the slide that I presented earlier in the Landsat, the spaghetti slide that you remember. That actually was some data that came from the Earth observation assessment. So how do we look at that across many, many systems that are provided and look for, are there choke points or bottlenecks in there where some of those intermediate products are really critically important? We tend to focus, like I said, on the systems themselves that provide the data, but there may be products that are the result of multiple Earth observation data sets that are especially critical for the agencies to use. So that this action actually gets to that analysis of that Earth observation data set to identify those choke points. And then the last 2 involve our international activities with Intergovernmental GEO that I spoke to earlier, and then AmeriGEO is actually a version of GEO that governs the Americas, so the countries involved in the Western Hemisphere. And so we pushed again for continued involvement in those activities. And then finally, the last item here, assess the landscape of the geospatial workforce training. How are we today? Are there ways to do that better? Are there any threats that we see to the pipeline of new talent coming in? Are people going into the universities? Are they selecting this as these remote sensing type degrees, or as the interest started to wane in that area. So this was an attempt to try to get at how could we make sure that there's going to be a steady pipeline of this type of workforce coming in the future. So I just wanted to highlight the data management working group. I know this is a data focused group that we're at ESIP. The data management working group has been really important historically within USGEO. It involves data management experts from across the different agencies involved with USGEO. And so in the past, they've developed a common framework for Earth observation data. And then they also facilitated some best practices across the agencies. How do we do a little better job to improve and standardize the way we manage all these data sets? And Earth observation data sets are very massive. So there are certainly lessons to be learned from the way the other agencies do this. So we have this data management working group, which we're actually standing up again. It's had a short hiatus because, again, we feel like this was a really critical function that USGEO plays. We want to make sure that we can get this group back up and running this year. And I think this might be the last slide, but it just speaks to that individual action that you saw earlier that I had highlighted in red, that we thought this might be an interesting action for this group in particular. It would be nice to get the ESIP perspectives on the data sources, a short-term Earth observations enterprise input, what could be the mechanisms for that input, and then would there be value in longer-term dialogue with different organizations and across ESIP. So I think that concludes the slides, if I'm not mistaken. So, I think I've been talking a lot. I think I'd like to give Lawrence and Martine a chance to maybe comment on what I just provided.
Sure, I can say a few things, and then I know that Aaron was in the chat was reminding everyone to go to Slido to add some questions in. I see there's a couple in there, so I'll just give some brief remarks, turn it over to Martine, and we can go to the questions. So a question we often get is, wow, what's the value of an interagency committee? Like, it sounds so bureaucratic. And I will say that one of the things that US has been able to do through USGEO and over to GEO is to really promote the open data policy that the US has really been encouraging over the years. And at the last GEO meeting, we actually saw that China and Japan had come forward and using the GEO setting to announce some new data that they were going to be providing on a full and open basis. And so that there are these opportunities to help encourage other countries to be having these open data policies. And then we're also looking to sort of see, as Tim mentioned, where are there ways that we can look for these dependencies, the choke points that might occur within the US federal systems, and through USGEO, we can give a voice to the administration to help them recognize items that really need to get addressed to improve the overall sort of value of the Earth observations activities that the federal agencies are doing, because we recognize that the data serves out to state and local governments, to companies, to NGOs, and to others. One of the things that we're really looking to sort of do is with this enterprise approach, really make sure that the national stands for beyond federal. And so we're really trying to make sure that we're engaging with private sector. And so one of the actions that Tim talked about is we're looking out to sort of see how might we engage with those accelerators and incubators that might be looking at startups to try and see, are there ways that we could be collectively supporting how they're using with Earth observations. We're thinking if they or other companies can be incorporating more Earth observations into the products and services that they're providing to their clients, that they're going to be a way to magnify or multiply the value that we get from Earth observations. That's part of what we're meaning by this enterprise approach. Tim talked a lot about the sort of collection that the private sector is providing. We're also looking to sort of see from the distribution standpoint, as well as how do we get sectors that are not the Earth observations companies, how do we get a broad range of sectors using more of the Earth observations data to drive the demand for Earth science research, for earth science data scientists and all. I mean, how do we drive the demand across all of that? And that part of what we wanted to do with this briefing with you all was to sort of see and invite the ESIP Federation into these discussions. So while we may be approaching it from the USGEO Subcommittee standpoint, if we're going to be having an enterprise approach to this national plan, we need people out in the community working with us to sort of see how do these efforts, how are they going to be grounded in what you're seeing in your own particular communities. So if there are people out there who are particularly interested, please let us know. We've got many ways that we can be working with you. We've also had a number of guest speakers into USGEO, both from NGOs. We've had people from the Copernicus program over in Europe talk to us to try and see. So if there are particular interests that you all have, we do have ways of doing that. So let me wrap up. I'll turn it over to Martine, and then we can go to some of the questions.
Thank you, Lawrence. As the new kid in town here, just my 5th week in the job, I really want to acknowledge something that often goes unnoticed for some. And it's the fact that USGEO has benefited from very strong leadership at the co-chair level with Lauren's team, and just recently, Dr. Karen St. Germain, who is now with NASA. These are very difficult times, but these co-chairs have managed to take this group into a next level and actually successfully published the Civil Earth Observations Plan last year. So I do want to acknowledge that. But I also want to acknowledge that the opportunity that we have right now with the Federation, with the partnership for ESIP, with 3 major goals, 11 initiatives, and more than 30 actions, as Tim pointed out during his presentation, we see ESIP at the heart of all of them. We are very good at quantifying the impact of the government assets for observations, but we're also getting very good at understanding the needs and the need for a better user engagement at all levels. So I think these are pretty good steps towards achieving a better enterprise architecture for observing systems in general, and not with keeping in mind that the ESIP has the knowledge that will allow us to get better results in a shorter term. So that's all I want to say.
Thanks so much, Martina. And it's great. I mean, you're new to USGEO in this position, but not new to ESIP. So it's really wonderful to have your perspective and all 3 of your perspectives. So Tim Stryker, I have been cleaning up the questions and trying to get just our USGEO questions, and we have about 10 minutes. So I think we have time to cover quite a few of these. So if you want to dive into the questions with these folks, that would be super.
Certainly, Aaron. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Although if give prerogative to my co-chair colleagues, Lawrence or Tim, Martine, if you wish to pick and choose, that'd be great. I was going to kind of focus on questions that addressed USGEO as a whole rather than a single agency, and see maybe the questions that get the most votes. And if the co-chairs wish to, and ESIP could aggregate any remaining questions that are attributable with people we can respond to, we can certainly look into responding to those questions as well. So a couple questions that got a lot of votes GEO seems to focus heavily on satellite observations. Can you talk about how in situ data are being supported and highlighted for inclusion?
Yeah, this is Lawrence. I can start, and certainly NASA's focus is on satellites, and I would say that we recognize that and we talk about this at USGEO quite a bit, that we recognize that the 3 co-chairs from NASA, NOAA, and USGS are from agencies that have a strong satellite basis. Obviously, NOAA and USGS also have strong in situ as well. So I want you to know that this topic does come up both at USGEO as well as GEO. Part of one of the things we're looking to do with this analysis of these data systems from the Earth observation assessment from years ago, this choke point, this dependency analysis that we talked about earlier, was specifically to draw out some of those issues related to in situ. So we recognize it's easy to talk about the satellites, or not just easy, it's frequently what we talk about. but we recognize that I think some of the, and that's maybe perhaps where the big money is, but we recognize as a co-chair team that we really need to be driving and helping to address some of the issues on in situ. And that's one of the reasons for wanting to do this analysis of those in situ systems that are in the Earth observation assessment. So I don't have a specific answer right now, but once we have this analysis done and understand a little bit more about those choke points and dependencies that are focused on the in situ area, I think we'll have a bit more to say. But let me see if Tim or Martine has anything.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I'm sure Martine would agree, there are certainly a lot of in situ sensors that USGS relies on and that NOAA rely on. I know the stream gauge sensors that we have, those are really incredibly valued across the boating community. People will look at that before they take their kayak out. They'll see, what does the stream gauge show me? Of course, we track flooding around the country. So there was a heavy use of in situ sensors in the Earth observation assessment we did back in 2016. A lot of those systems showed up in the top 10, top 20. So it wasn't just space systems, but Lawrence is right. We have heard this before that we do tend to, I guess maybe I'm a space guy and Lawrence might be a space guy. I mean, we tend to talk space a little more often, but the reality is that there's a lot of really good in situ data out there. And our actions that we drafted really meant not just for the space side of things, but for in situ as well. You can imagine NOAA has sensors that look at streams and rivers, USGS does. How do we maybe standardize those in some fashion? So it's the same issue that you have in space with a lot of different disparate space sensors collecting information. How do you compare them? How do you calibrate and validate them? And so the same goes for in situ, maybe times 10 or times 100, because there are so many more in situ data sets. So I'll turn it over to Martine.
Yeah, I just want to add that NOAA, as a matter of fact, is considering rotating leadership for the co-chairs of the subcommittee with non-NESDIS executives. That means folks that work at the Ocean Service or in fisheries are also invited to be part of the leadership team so they can address the non-satellite assets. So we are thinking about that and we are working on it.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Next question here, particularly pertinent, I think, to the Data Management Working Group and the USGEO data experts. Can you comment on how you are sharing metadata about these data sets across the US Earth observation enterprise?
This is Lawrence. I don't have a lot other than to say this is, I think, one of the issues that we want the new Data Management Working Group to take on and come to the subcommittee level with some recommendations and issues.
Yeah, I would agree. Obviously, metadata is important, and for some data sets, you'll find the metadata out there with the primary data set, but for others, you don't. So you have to hunt for it. And so that's exactly what we're looking for from the Data Management Working Group, is that's a topic that they can dig into pretty quickly.
And I will say that, Jeff de la Boujadière, we miss you.
Hyping up to just say he's on the call. Hey, Jeff.
Yes, kudos out to Jeff. So another question that got a number of votes. How can ESIP as a community help USGEO advance goal 3, specifically to improve the impact of Earth observations?
So there's two aspects of goal 3 when you read into a little bit more, and that action that's looking at the impact. There's both a qualitative side and a quantitative side. And so on the qualitative, we are looking specifically for stories and anecdotes about how a wide range of organizations are using Earth observations. Our hope and our expectation is that as more and more organizations and sectors hear how others are doing, perhaps their competitors are, how they're using Earth observations, that more organizations will want to adopt it as well. And in that way, it could expand the impact. Now, we certainly recognize that companies, look for competitive advantage, and so they don't always want to share exactly what they're doing. But to the extent that we can get some examples out there, about how many different industries are using Earth observations, that can have this multiplier effect. So the extent that ESIP Federation, with its breadth across many different sectors, can help bring in and gather some of these stories, or maybe we can have an award competition, or maybe we can have a story competition about uses of Earth science information. Maybe that's a way that we can partner with you to gather more of these stories, and then our communication teams can help get those out more and more. So that's on the qualitative side. We're also looking on the quantitative side of things, where we're looking to sort of see how do we, from a social or an economic standpoint, sort of quantify the benefits that come from this. What is the sort of return on investment that comes from using Earth observations data? And so at least the 3 agencies plus some others are building up the repository on the literature around quantifying the impacts. But to the extent that other people also have, stories about the quantitative impact, I think that's part of what we're doing. And so I think the first step, and if ESIP can help let us gather and improve the repository, and then as it starts building up, we can be working with our communications teams and our leadership to make sure that those stories goes out broader.
Yeah, I would echo the use of the case studies. They're really powerful, and sometimes the quantitative studies get all the press because they have big dollar figures attached to them. But the case studies, the actual uses are so interesting and powerful just in themselves. So a few years ago, we found out Gallowine was using Landsat's thermal imager to do evapotranspiration measurements across all their vineyards globally, and so. And when we met with them, we weren't really sure of how much they were using it, but the story that they told was so powerful that it echoed whenever we talked to staffers, when we talked to anyone within the administration, they got it instantly. They understood that there's economic value there. But those types of case studies, sometimes they're hard to come up with if you don't know about them in advance. So whatever help ESIP can provide in those areas would be really, we would really appreciate that.
I think you said it all. ESIP has the knowledge and they can help us do things better.
Okay, thank you. So keeping with the theme of the private sector, the question to the co-chairs is, has the private sector's thirst for geospatial information had any influence on funding and policy around the future of Earth observations?
Jim or Martine, do you want to start this time? I've been starting all the others. But
well,
happy
the way
to.
That, I think we're approaching this time is by having some subgroups working on commercial engagement, user engagement, and well, this is not a new concept, but it's starting to be a little more influential in the way that we're trying to think about this, because historically we have not been able to engage that well with the folks that are part of this equation, the private sector, academia. We are in need of creating more forums like ESIP in which we can address the needs more specifically and in a more targeted way. So it's a work in progress.
I can just say that there's definitely a thirst for more information. And so all the users we talk to, they want more data. They want better spatial, better spectral, better temporal. And so the same is out in the commercial sector. I think, again, though, sometimes it gets to what type of data are you discussing? There are many different data sets available, different phenomenologies. And so it takes some process to determine what is it that they really need. And so we have this agnostic approach where when we talk to users, we don't ask them what sensor do you need. It's more about what actually are you using Earth observation data for. So whether that translates or not into more dollars is kind of a hard question to answer, because in some sense you see the government competing with the private sector, and so in terms of some Earth observations. So I think the concept of the enterprise was really critical to this plan, because we wanted the private sector and the government to think that they are in this together. So they shouldn't think of themselves as competitors when it comes to providing Earth observations for sure, or using Earth observations. I mean, we should be thinking of ourselves as an entity that are cooperating we're each providing data that the other needs. We're each using data from the other. I think it's important for that concept to come out.
If I can just add briefly, I think we're seeing the influence around the commercial companies that are coming in to provide data. So we know that there's a range of companies that are coming in. So I think companies, startups, or some of the others, obviously there's Maxar and Planet, which have been around for a while, but there's a lot of other companies as well. I think they're sort of seeing the thirst by the government as well as the private sector for geospatial information. And so that is certainly affecting the future of Earth observations, and you'll see it in the national plan, where we reflect the fact that we need to look more for a commercial company for some of the data that they can be providing. So that's one aspect of it. Now that may be more on the satellite side of things, and reflecting some of the other comments as well. What is it going to translate to when it comes to in situ or other sorts of data? Are there going to be, corollaries when it comes to getting private companies to be providing data that, is for other types of geospatial information? So that's some aspects of it. And then I think you're also sort of seeing companies come in to do the analytics role. So there's some degree is about the data providing itself, but I think what we're hearing is that there's a lot more money to be made in that analytics side of things. And so that's part of it. And I think some of that is sort of the cloud providers are providing both the data storage capabilities as well as some of those analytic tools that can go with it. So I think that's another place where you're seeing the private sector come in and to this Earth observation space and all. Now, I'll say this: if the private sector is going to the Hill to say that, hey, we need a follow-on to the soil moisture active passive mission, then I'm not aware of it. I would love to hear that. But if they are doing that, and if that's translated into funding and policy, then I just haven't heard it. But perhaps that is going on, and that's not the sort of thing that they would be sharing publicly. So. Erin, how are we doing on time?
So we are just at the end of our time. Thanks so much for checking. And I wondered if, well, first I would like to thank all four of you for your willingness to contribute this morning. I think that what I've gotten from the ESIP community is that they want to hear a lot more about USGEO, and there's, I think, a lot of really interesting partnerships. I know that your time, all four of you, your time is tight, but I'm wondering if you might hang around for just a few minutes at the end of this as people start dropping off. Annie and I were just wanting to touch on the lab and the potential for the interaction with the competition within the lab. Does that work for your schedule? Okay. And then for everybody else, I'm going to share my screen briefly. So when I started this plenary this morning, we talked a little bit about the feedback we've been getting on wanting more connection spaces. So we're heading into an hour break. I would encourage you to stretch your legs, get a snack, do whatever. But if you're looking for places to connect with ESIP folks, there are two other spots that I want to call out. Actually, there are maybe three. So the first is we've added some whiteboard and social rooms to the bottom of this space. So if you just scroll down in the Kiko chat space that you're in, you'll see that there's some whiteboard rooms and some social rooms. And those are really for Zoom conversations that end too quickly and places where you can connect within this space so that we don't lose each other. There's also the Research Showcase and Funding Friday. So ideas were added on Friday, so I would encourage you to check out the Funding Friday space. We have a lot of great ideas that have been added so far. And then we still have the Research Showcase posters, and the presentations there are available for comment. And so on Thursday, we're going to come back to those Research Showcase posters one more time for another about 45 minutes of working and talking with the presenters. So those are places where you can find each other and connect. And then there's also our Slack group if you are on Slack. So I know that that's a lot, but if you're interested and need help, just put a note in the live chat as well. So that's it. So thank you all so much for coming today. It was great to see all of you, and we will start our sessions in about 55 minutes. Thank you. So Lawrence and Martine, Annie is here, and one of the things that was just catching our attention when goals 2 and 3 were coming by were about ways that we might engage. So Annie, thoughts?
Yeah, well, first, hi, Martine. Hi, Lawrence. Hi, Martine. Nice to meet you.
Nice meeting you.
Yeah, so I'm the lab director, and one of the things, so when Tim was talking just about the, like the case, there's like the case, oh, hi, Tim. The kind of a couple places. So, well, first, the thing that stood out was just nice that this was framed as a geo talk and not just kind of our federal partners, because it's often like us explaining that we're a neutral convening ground where people from across agencies can come together. And I think framing this as geo was like, there is another space that people are working together. So I thought that was nice. But it sounds like there's the very practical, as we hear user stories, to ping you all and say, this is how we're hearing people are using data. And in my role as the lab director, we give out probably 10 of these microfunding grants a year. And I would say 80% of them are using satellite imagery, 100% of them are using earth science observations. And these are young, early career people that are building applications, that are trying and experimenting with using earth observations in interesting ways. And so just knowing the communication channel to let you know, these are 5 projects that have kind of been impactful or interesting. And this is this is the data that they're using. Because they're often interesting stories. Because we give out a small amount of money for these projects, the PIs tend to be scrappy, they're tech forward, and are often doing things that might be good stories to communicate in terms of ways that Earth observation data are being used. So it would be good to know from you all just what's the best communication channel when we hear of those kind of stories, to let you all know. So so maybe we can get that in an email later, but that would be really good to know. And the other thing that I was, Lawrence, you had mentioned the challenges. And I wonder within USGEO if you guys use the challenge.gov space, or if you have ventured into that and found success, or if you have any particular, what are your sticking points within that kind of innovation space? So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so I know different agencies have have authorities to do the sort of the prize competitions and others. So we've been doing quite a bit at NASA, and we actually have someone, her name is Shobhana Gupta, who is within Earth Science Division, specifically looking at prize competitions, and NASA has one overall. And so I meet with her every other week to sort of say, great, what's new? What are the new ideas? And so I would love to put her in touch with you so that we can do a joint. It doesn't have to be just NASA ESIP. I mean, it could be USGEO ESIP. And so I'd be happy to have Shobhana work on some interagency activity. And so challenge.gov is one aspect. NASA has some other sort of avenues, but I'd be happy for us to sort of co-brand it. One thing I do want to ask is, I know that satellites are near and dear to our hearts. I agree with Tim. I'm a satellite guy, but at the same time, we're Earth science, we're Earth observations, and we're trying to make the point that it's more than just satellite. I am all sort of interested in like how might we be able to look more and pursue more related to in situ observations or in situ with satellite? How can we be encouraging more of that? I mean, is there some opportunities with ESIP related to that? So let me leave it at that and see whether Martine and Tim have comments.
Okay.
First.
I was going to say on your first item, the case studies that I discussed in my presentation, Krista Straub from Fort Collins has been our.
I know that name.
Yeah, Krista, she's been in a lot of these community sessions. So what I would encourage is that if you can get those to Krista, and we can pass you the email address and stuff, that would be really useful. She can make sure that her counterparts in the other agencies get access to them as well.
Okay.
And for my part,
Krista's on.
I am taking note.
Hi, Krista. Oh, sorry, Martine, go ahead.
Oh, no. I'm taking notes here because I really don't have any point of contact that I could refer for this particular topic, but I'm taking notes and I'll try to get back to you.
Okay, great. And I mean, so 2 follow-ups. One, Lawrence, on your in situ comment, when you say more in situ things, is it the case studies? Is it how, I guess, is it just broadly? I mean, you could go, if you go to AGU, you'd hear 20,000 examples of how people are using data, and you could go along. So what is it more specifically than just acknowledging that lots of researchers are using different data types, but from the USGEO perspective, is it, people specifically using data sources collected from a certain agency to work towards like a UN development goal? Or is it like, what is it just beyond someone using this data that makes it particularly impactful or intriguing to USGEO?
So I think there's always the surprising aspect in terms of if people are using it for something that you wouldn't normally expect. How can we get that positive sort of shock and awe, or that surprising aspect? Like, wow, I never knew that agency collected that data, or I never knew that industry used data. So I think one of the things we're looking to do when we do this analysis of these dependencies is, I think we're really, and I think Tim showed this in some of his slides, is show to the connection points. That was the surprising elements to be like, wow, I never realized that data product, when you fed it through, served this other sorts of thing. And we're especially looking to sort of see, how does that support connections between agencies? Now, ideally, if I could snap my fingers and have this across, not just government agencies, but if we could do this across industries and sort of show how data products from maybe one federal agency are mapped into the products and services of other companies, and then, or NGOs, and how that comes out. I think those are the sorts of things that would make for those surprising stories that I think could make some really, really engaging, outreach materials that could help people to be like, oh my gosh, wow, if they're using it for that, why isn't my organization using it for this? Or like, oh wow, that data scientist, maybe that person really is right. We really need to be doing more in this area. And so I think those are some of the things. Now, obviously it's much easier said than done, but I think we want to start using this dependencies analysis, these choke point analysis, so we can even start doing those within the federal government. And maybe that can help draw in and ask people, what are some of the stories that you have about how you're using these systems? And if ESIP can help, both with the outreach and the collection and some of the analysis, you all reach many more sectors and expertise than we do.
I think the stories have to connect, and I think, like I mentioned, the Gala wine one, we had briefed applications many times to our leadership, and nothing really resonated as much as the Gala wine one. And I don't know if it was just because everybody drinks wine, or that just seemed to be something that was very popular. But so not every story is going to carry the same weight. And I think you just want to look for ways to connect with people that are out there that maybe are non-scientists. Where does this really connect and make a difference? And I think those stories are very powerful. So you know them when you see them usually.
And for my part, I'm going to use one of the expressions that my former boss and former co-chair for NOAA used to say, Karen St. Germain: buy when you can and build if you must. And that relates to the fact that we are starting to look more seriously at commercial buy. And I do see ESIP understanding and knowing where those sources can be found, and also how effective can be, because they're the ones that will test it first.
Interesting. Krista,
so
do you have, sorry, go ahead, Lawrence.
I'm sorry, Krista, I can go. I'll go after you, Krista.
Well, I was just going to ask Krista, as the one that hears a lot of these stories, that the ones that end up being really impactful, or that you see, like not just for the non-scientists, but I wonder, like, when things come across your desk, what ends up being impactful, both from the like non-scientist, oh, that's how geospatial data is valuable, but that how the ones that both resonate at that level and the next level up in the policy level, not just the kind of warm, warm fuzzy level.
Yeah, it's probably a longer conversation, but I think Tim had a good point. Like, for the general public and even thinking kind of higher up, those stories or the narratives or qualitative interviews that have kind of the overarching theme that relates to everyday use, which is getting a little bit harder as we think of some of machine learning and AI. So we're looking at different ways to communicate those stories to kind of have relevance across a wide audience. But yeah, I mean, the gallows is a great example because there's a common theme no matter sort of what level you're at.
Yeah. It's funny because I was asked by NASA, my PhD research was in snow hydrology, and I created an output that used MODIS data. And then I happened to be in Utah and I started meeting with the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center, which sat at the National Weather Service office, which was in NOAA. And we started realizing that this output that I was creating could augment their snowmelt model, which was a fairly simple temperature and snow melt. But the output from my research showed kind of was able to bring albedo into the mix, which modifies the rate of snow melt, but is a more complex snow melt model. So long story short, just through presenting and having conversations with them, now still 10 years after I finished my degree, they're still using the output from my research that is a MODIS product that was funded through a NASA Earth and Space Science Fellowship. But this River Forecast Center is using that to augment their snowmelt model and improve river forecasts that are still going out today. And that was really just through conversation. That was a real just, going out to the office and saying, this is what I'm working on. It would seem to have relevance to what you were doing, and having like someone at the River Forecast Center listen. You also have to have people at a certain level that are interested in dealing with students or the research community, that are like, would even open the door to someone in the research community to have that. So, but I think it was several years ago, someone from one of the like story communication channels had kind of heard about that and asked me to like show how your NASA data works with NOAA data and this and that, but it doesn't have the Gallo wine panache. It has the, river forecast, agriculture people are interested in it. So it's just interesting to see what sticks and what doesn't in that space. So, but yeah, I feel some personal connection to it because I feel like I had a little bit of one of those connectivity stories.
Yeah, I think albedo is a great example of a science concept that a wide audience can understand, and that has a good way to provide like a visual sort of explanation of it. So thinking about that with new sort of data use and AI and that, so we need to move that sort of concept across these other topics.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. I mean, some of these science concepts that are more tangible to a public, albedo is a really easy one. So maybe that's a good touch point, that there are some science concepts that are not as easy to transition into those stories. So that's a really good point.
I think this also sort of brings up this issue, what I've heard the communications people talk about, sort of the call to action. What is it that, if we're communicating out and we're sharing these stories, that we talked about, whether qualitative or quantitative, what is that action we're expecting people to take? In some cases, it may just be, awareness or appreciation that NGOs, government agencies, and others are sort of working on the public's benefit. Okay, that's great. In some cases, it may be we want to motivate them to try and pursue Earth observations data, or other kinds of earth science information to try and see how it might integrate into the decisions that their organizations are sort of doing. And, and since ESIP it has a much broader breadth of sectors than USGEO does. That could also be a key place where ESIP could come in to help, to help people translate this interesting story into, okay, but how might you actually use it? And I think maybe this gets to what Ted was talking about, like, okay, what's the metadata, or what's the interoperability sorts of things, so that data can actually get used. I mean, if someone was to hear one of these stories, whether it's Gallo or something else, and say, great, I want to pursue it. Okay, you have to access it. You have to discover, you have to access, there's the get it into your system. You all, the data scientists in ESIP know all about the difficulties that are related to that. And so
the less sexy story, the story becomes much
well,
much
but it's the sort of like,
painful.
great, if we can attract through one thing and then sort of say, look, your concierge through this process is the ESIP Federation. Is that a way? So that was one thing. The second thing I wanted to raise was, Tim mentioned this group called JACIE, JACIE. And you all may know, but I don't know how many other people are still on. It's the Joint Agency Commercial, Joint Agency Commercial Imagery Evaluation Group. I think I have something related to that. And so it's related to commercial imagery. It's been around, I don't know, like 15 years or something like that. And it's a way to help government agencies and military, like NGA, work with private companies who have commercial imagery and to go through this formal evaluation. One of the things we identified within USGEO was to say, well, can we create the JC for other types of Earth observations where it's not just commercial imagery? And so we could, we threw around, do we just want to increase JC's scope and have it do other types of Earth observations? We actually kind of realized, that's maybe not the best approach. They should be sticking to commercial imagery. But do we want to create a corollary or several corollaries for other kinds of information, Earth science information, and commercial information? And are there specific types of in situ data or other kinds of Earth science, whether it's satellite or other sorts of information, where a neutral evaluation body would also serve an important role? And so if ESIP has ideas for where you all see this to be really important, for it to be this evaluation of the data, believe me, we'd love to hear. The third thing,
go ahead.
The third thing I wanted to say is also mentioned in the plan, we didn't get to it as much today, is the whole issue related to AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, data visualization sorts of things. So it's definitely in the plan. We didn't highlight it as much today. And obviously it's really easy to just throw around the acronyms. And the hard part is getting to, okay, but what actually specifically needs to get done? What is the specific challenge, whether it's a technical challenge or whether it's application to a thematic area? And again, if there are some things that ESIP with that community approach can help highlight, then whether through challenges or through other means, I mean, if USGEO can call attention to it to the administration, that's one thing. If agencies within USGEO can come together and help work with ESIP on a challenge, that's another potential item that we could be doing related to this. Okay.
Yeah, it seems the streaming data space, the IoT space. I mean, when you were talking about the Gallo wine, when I was in grad school, it was microsensors and viticulture. It was kind of when everyone started putting sensors everywhere and realizing microclimates and targeted agriculture. And that was however many years ago. So just the proliferation of streaming non-satellite data, I would think would be rich for kind of your point to Lawrence of other types of JC-like organizations. So anyway, Erin, did you?
So yeah, I want to be conscious of time. One, it's this was so wonderful to have just this kind of informal conversation. Lawrence, Martine, Tim, this is kind of our equivalent of like end of the session, front of the stage talk. And so I just want to be conscious of the time. But Krista, I also wanted to mention before we go, just the public-private partnership cluster that you have started that had a great session last week and is going to meet next week. And you know, maybe I'm not sure if this is an appropriate place to have more of those conversations, but maybe it is. So just what you think on that front.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some overlap between the goals of that cluster and this in this discussion. So I think that's a good starting point. And then Annie, we could maybe talk and see if there's other ways to bring clusters together, or if we need to, you know, look into more of this case study sort of cluster approach or something like that. But I think that would be kind of a good initial meeting for sure. I can drop it in. I'll drop the time in here.
Nice, that would be awesome. And I also just want Lawrence, Martine, and Tim, our new executive director, Susan Shingledecker, has been listening in on this conversation with us and is also here. I think she just turned on her camera. So just a quick hi to Susan. For all three of you, we'll set up other conversations, but I did just want to point out that she's here. And Susan, if you want to jump in and say anything.
Yeah, I've kind of this week and last week, I'm really in listening and learn and meet mode, but really excited about these conversations and where we can take this. I was really, really excited about this